Hello y'all, welcome to my channel. My name is Kimu, and today we'll be looking at Ed Sheeran, says Naya's resident belligerent delinquent and F-boy.
Yeah, so bad.
Childe is equipped with the water blades, where he turns his bow into a weapon made of pure water dealing hydro damage and enters his melee stance. This allows him to perform swift attacks that apply hydro onto enemies while also dealing hydro damage in succession. In today's pool of characters in Genshin Impact, Childe is still the only character with a stance change mechanic that revolves around the use of an elemental skill, compared to Resin, whose stance changes are through her elemental burst. Now before we begin, I would like to preface this discussion by saying that I'm a budget player, meaning I'm neither free-to-play nor a massive whale. I can only afford Welkin Moons at the moment, and I've only bought the Battle Pass a couple times, so my access to certain characters, weapons, and constellations are limited to what I gained over the past year of playing Genshin Impact. And with that said, let's get right into it. We'll begin by going over the core of Childe's gameplay and builds, starting off with his talents. His normal attacks perform up to 6 consecutive shots with a bow that deals physical damage. His charge attack will deal hydro damage and apply Riptide status. Riptide's AoE hydro damage can be procced in 2 ways. The first, through Riptide Flash, where you hit an enemy with a charge attack causing them to take 3 consecutive hits of AoE hydro damage. And second, through Riptide Burst, where defeating an enemy marked with Riptide creates a burst that will deal AoE hydro damage and apply Riptide to enemies caught in the AoE. Next, his elemental skill. Activating this will cause Childe to enter a melee stance as he alters his bow into hydro weapons dealing hydro damage to enemies standing next to him. His melee stance converts his normal and charge attacks into hydro damage and cannot be overridden by any other forms of elemental infusion. This includes Chongyun's elemental skill AoE and Bennett's elemental burst AoE. However, he cannot perform plunge attacks in this stance. During his melee stance, Childe can apply Riptide whenever he deals a crit, and upon damaging enemies affected by Riptide, he can proc Riptide Slash, which will deal AoE hydro damage. Riptide Slash can only happen once every 1.5 seconds. His normal and charge attacks damage and his Riptide Slash damage scale with his elemental skill's talent level and not with his range stance normal attack talent level. Pressing his elemental skill again or switching to another character while in his melee stance will revert Childe back onto his range bow stance. Keep in mind that the longer he stays in his melee stance, the longer his elemental skill will be on cooldown. Next is Elemental Burst. His Elemental Burst has 2 forms. First, his range stance burst fires a hydro arrow that will explode in front of him, dealing AoE hydro damage, and applies Riptide onto enemies. Casting his burst in his range stance will refund 20 energy back onto Childe. Second, his melee stance burst has Childe perform a slash that deals hydro damage in a massive AoE, and triggers Riptide Blast. Riptide Blast removes the Riptide status of enemies in exchange of a Hydro Explosion, which deals AoE hydro damage. And while it does more damage versus his range stance burst, he will not get a refund for his energy. And as mentioned earlier, this removes the Riptide status of enemies, which is why it's highly recommended to always use his range stance burst over his melee stance burst. Childe's Ascension 2 passive extends the Riptide status duration on enemies by 8 seconds, and his Ascension 4 passive, as previously mentioned, allows him to apply Riptide onto enemies whenever he deals a crit in his melee stance. And lastly, his base passive increases your own party member's normal attack talent level by 1, which on paper sounds pretty nice, but is actually very impractical since it doesn't buff his melee stance damage, and the characters who are usually run with Childe don't get to use their normal attacks. So after looking at his talents, you want to level them up starting off with his elemental skill, followed by his elemental burst, and lastly his normal attacks, to which you can actually just leave at level 1 or level 2 as it's shown here, since other parts of his talent's damage don't scale off of it, and you are unlikely to use his ranged, normal, and charge attacks against most of the enemies in the game. Now we're going to be discussing his weapon access. Childe is one of the characters in Genshin Impact who has a wide range of weapons he can use depending on where you are at in the game, and it will also depend on the stats and utility you're looking for in order to boost Childe's damage. For 3 stars, we have the Raven Bow, which has the highest base attack for 3-star weapons, with an elemental mastery substat and a passive which increases damage against enemies affected by Hydro or Pyro. This is a solid starter choice for Childe when he is ran with a vaporized team comp. And then, we have the Slingshot, which has a lower base attack but provides a lot of crit rate. However, the passive does not apply to Childe's melee stance damage, so this weapon is primarily for the crit rate stat stick. For 4 stars, beginning with the craftables, we have the Prototype Crescent. The Prototype Crescent has a solid base attack paired with an attack percentage substat, and a passive which grants movement speed and an attack boost for a few seconds upon hitting an enemy's weak spot with a charge shot. If you can land the snipe onto the enemy's weak spot, then this weapon will do pretty decent. And then we have the Hamayumi, which has a lower base attack paired with a higher attack percentage substat, and the passive which on paper looks pretty good, but impractical since Childe usually begins his rotation by casting his ranged stance elemental burst, so he isn't able to utilize the 100% increase of the weapon's normal and charge attack damage. Now for the 4-star gacha weapons. Starting off with the Rust. To quote Mr. Slice, this weapon is pretty much a normal attack steroid, with a decent base attack and an attack percentage stat stick. This weapon becomes more of a normal attack steroid with refinements, up to an 80% normal attack damage increase for Childe's melee stance. Alley Hunter. Albeit I do not have this weapon, and I'm sure many of you don't either, especially since it was a limited weapon back in 1.4, is a very strong weapon for Childe's burst. With a high base attack and attack percentage substat, the passive ramps up Childe's damage when he is off-field, which often happens when he is run in a vaporized team comp where you spend some time funneling energy onto your other characters such as Shang Ling. And once Childe enters back onto the field, where he usually begins his rotation with his ranged elemental burst, he is able to land some pretty big vaporized nukes. To where we follow up with the Stringless. Now unlike Alley Hunter, many players have access to this weapon, and the passive provides an unconditional buff to your elemental burst damage. So if you're looking to make an esports vape nuke for Childe, this is the weapon for you. It carries a decent base attack, and a lot of elemental mastery for its substat. Do keep in mind, however, that the elemental skill buff only applies to the initial hit when Childe swaps to his melee stance, and not his melee normal and charge attacks. And lastly, we have his best in slot 4-star weapon, the Viridescent Hunt, which gives a decent amount of base attack, and paired with a crit rate substat. The weapon has a passive that can vacuum enemies into a Cyclone AoE for a few seconds, thus allowing Childe to proc multiple instances of riptide damage against grouped up enemies. This weapon, however, is locked behind the battle pass, but if you are able to spend some money to buy it and are looking to get a strong weapon for Childe, then I highly recommend getting this weapon. And now for the 5 stars. Apart from the Elegy for the End, which is a support-based bow, the other 4 out of 5 weapons are pretty strong and slot in very well for Childe. Let's begin with Amos Bow. Though not exactly designed for Childe, still provides a lot of damage from its high base attack, attack percentage substat, and the base percentage increase to his normal and charge attacks. Skyward Harp provides the highest base attack for 5-star bow weapons with a good amount of crit rate and crit damage. Thundering Pulse gives a high base attack and a huge amount of crit damage from its substat, a decent amount of attack percentage, and a secondary passive that can stack and ramps up your normal attack damage. And lastly, his new signature weapon, the Polar Star, gives a high base attack and a crit rate substat equal to a crit rate circlet, a primary passive that increases the elemental skill and elemental burst damage, and a secondary passive that provides an attack percentage boost that ramps up with stacks. Now we move on to his recommended artifacts. Your search for your stats from your artifacts should prioritize main stat and substats first. You want an attack percentage Sands, a hydro damage Goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage Circlet. An attack percentage Goblet is a solid substitute when you're unable to build a hydro damage Goblet that fits your needs. Once you have your main stats and substats, you can slowly transition to building your artifact set bonuses. Beginning with the 4-piece sets, we have the unconditional, well-rounded Heart of Depth set, which was made for Childe. Its 2-piece set bonus provides 15% hydro damage bonus, and the 4-piece after casting Childe's melee stance increases his normal and charge attack damage by 30% for 15 seconds. This fits well within his off-field duration, allowing for a shorter cooldown on his elemental skill. The 4-piece Shimenawa's Reminiscence set is a strong alternative for Childe. Its 2-piece set bonus provides an 18% attack increase, and the 4-piece, when after casting Childe's melee stance, increases his normal and charge attack damage by 50% for 10 seconds, which is the typical amount of time you want to be spending on his melee stance, at the cost of 15 energy. As for which set you should farm, will depend highly on which domain that provides the most efficient dual usage of their partnered artifact sets. So those are the Blizzard Slayer set, paired with the Heart of Depth set, and the Emblem of Severed Fate set, paired with the Shimenawa's Reminiscence set. For 2-piece sets, your main 2-piece set should be the Heart of Depth, which can be paired with either of the following sets: Shimenawa's or Gladiators for the 18% attack increase, Noblesse for the 20% elemental burst damage increase, and Emblem of Severed Fate for the 20% energy recharge. The Noblesse and Glad pieces can be obtained by crafting them using the strong boxes. With his core complete, let's discuss Childe's Constellations. Childe's Constellations mostly revolve around increasing his on-field damage output through increasing the uptime on his abilities while also lowering their downtime. Constellation 1 lowers the cooldown of Childe's elemental skill by 20% of the time he exits his melee stance. Thus, his cooldown timers drop from 6 to 36 seconds to 4.8 to 29 seconds. This helps with making rotations easier and allows for Childe to generate a bit more energy during his uptime on his melee stance before swapping out. Constellation 2 gives a flat 4 energy gain upon defeating enemies marked with Riptide. In fights where there are a lot of enemies, this allows Childe to generate a lot of energy for himself with the use of his AoE hydro damage, and it guarantees a lot of uptime on your burst, especially when using his range stance burst. Constellation 3 bumps up your elemental skills talent level up by 3. Constellation 4 now procs additional Riptide slashes and flashes. This adds up to his already swift hydro application as they proc every 4 seconds. However, the effects of Riptide from this constellation are independent from Childe's standard Riptide flashes that proc every 0.7 seconds and Riptide slashes that proc every 1.5 seconds. The only caveat to this constellation is that setting up massive Vaporize nukes with Childe's burst can be quite hard, as the Riptide procs will apply Hydro at the moment when you don't want it to. So C4 plus Childe mains, be wary. Constellation 5 bumps up your Elemental Burst talent level by 5. And lastly, his Constellation 6 will reset Childe's elemental skill cooldown after you cast his Elemental Burst in his melee stance. From here, his playstyle changes from range burst to melee burst. Now we move on to his team compositions. As mentioned before, his role is to provide constant hydro application onto enemies, which will enable his other party members to deal massive amounts of damage. So his best team compositions revolve around Vaporize, Electro-charge or Taser, and lastly Freeze. For Vaporize comps, as many of you know, Xiangling's Pyronado will be dancing around Childe as he hacks and slashes the enemy with constant Hydro. And because there is no ICD or internal cooldown for Hydro, Xiangling is able to reverse vaporize her damage. The third slot includes Bennett for double Pyro Resonance, healing, attack buffs, and will act as a battery for Xiangling. And the last slot includes an Anemo support, carrying a 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set for shredding enemy resistances, transferring buffs such as Elemental Mastery or Elemental Damage bonus, and providing a lot of crowd control for your characters. For Taser comps, Taser comps maximizes AoE damage by bouncing electro-charge between enemies with Beidou's Elemental Burst, and paired with another electro character for Resonance, which gives more energy generation. The second electro character will usually be Fischl, or as of recently, Raiden Shogun for maximum value. Lisa is another substitute with her AoE Elemental Burst and Defense Shred. However, her energy cost and generation leave much to be desired. For the last slot, it can be filled by either Bennett for healing and attack buffs, an Anemo support carrying a 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set, or my personal favorite, Xingqiu, as Xingqiu will provide additional damage reduction with his rain swords on top of Beidou's damage reduction, and Xingqiu also provides Hydro Resistant Shred with his Constellation too, and will act as an additional battery for Childe. And for Freeze comps, it primarily maximizes crowd control, which in turn maximizes your character's damage through a consistent cryo applier. Cryo characters include Kaya, Rosaria, or even Ganyu with her Elemental Burst. The third slot can be filled by another cryo character for Cryo Resonance buff, which will give your entire party a 15% increase to your crit rate. That cryo character can be either of the aforementioned characters, or Diona for healing, a shield bot, and a cryo battery. And the last slot can either be filled by a third cryo support, or an Anemo support carrying a 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set, or even Xingqiu for more Hydro DPS. Alright, with all of that out of the way, I'm going to be showcasing Childe in the floor 12 of Spiral Abyss, using two different team comps. The first one, it's going to be the National or Vaporized team comp, and the second will be the Electro-charge or Taser team comp. My Childe is going to be running a Viridescent Hunt, and his artifact sets are going to include the 2-piece Hydro set and the 2-piece Noblesse set for the extra burst damage. I hope you guys enjoy.
6308話が通じないなら逃げられるかな。やはり熱々でしょ。師匠の技を食らいなさ。止水の矢。みんながそばに。はい。熱々6308式ユニット9。いや。それは。いや。痛いから我慢しろよ。くらえ。瀬戸際だろ。俺の得意分野さ。隙を見せるのはほんの一瞬だ。いや。安全距離。逃げられるかな。みんな抜く攻撃。痛いから我慢しろよ。黒き翼。これが海山を滅ぼした。股間を見。この件はわかるか。いや。隙を見せるのはほんの一瞬だ。いや。夜の権限。炭になるがいい。いかよにしとなれ。答えなさい。 慢しろよ。
暗き翼行くぞ。
よく見ておけ。
だよに備え。
止水の矢狂乱怒涛。止水の矢狂乱怒涛。いやはっいや
夜の権限。
はい、うるさ
はい、この件はわかるか。これが改ざんを。
逃げられるかな。いやはっいやはっはっ
I hope y'all find this guide useful, and if you do, please leave a like on this video, leave a comment below about what y'all think, and subscribe to look forward to future Abyss runs and guide videos. This is my first time making a guide video, and I plan on making more soon. Up next is gonna be Hu Tao, since her banner is coming up very soon. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you all next time.